Hello and welcome to the first in a large series of projected small lectures that I'd like to call the Jewish History Lab. Now I'm calling it a lab because this is somewhat experimental in nature. I'm very proud to let you know that I've signed a contract with Koren Publishers Jerusalem, really important publishing house that does really beautiful work. I have so many of their books in my own collection, and I'm very honored to be producing a multi-volume, massive survey history of the Jews for them over the course of the next few years. So these lectures are kind of like my rough draft of the materials that will ultimately find their way into the printed word, and I hope you will snap up copies of them when they're available because I think they're going to be great. I'm really excited about this particular work. So it's experimental in the sense that I'm going to put my first draft together in this video format and put it up on the internet, and I'd love to hear from you. Please insert your comments in the box below this video and let me know what you think and if you have any questions or suggestions, and then we'll see how we go forward as I transform these lectures into the written word. But let's get straight to the material. Let's look at this little piece of global real estate and try to understand how it fits within the larger perspective of the history of the Jewish people. Many people tend to look at the land of Israel something like this amazing 6th century map that was discovered in Madaba, Jordan. Now, what do I mean? They look at it this way. It looks intriguing and fascinating, but at the same time illogical and confusing. So what exactly is this map? First of all, it was discovered in Madaba, Jordan. You can see here's a screenshot of where it appears on Google Maps, just a little bit northeast of the Dead Sea, a little south of Amman. And it was in the floor of a 6th century church that was designed for pilgrims, Christian pilgrims, who were making their way into the land of Israel from the west. And it was intended as kind of like a permanent physical reminder of how to find the various holy sites. It was discovered in the late 19th century in the course of church renovations, and unfortunately this gorgeous mosaic was badly damaged over the centuries. Nevertheless, a significant amount of it was preserved, and we can learn some fascinating things about how they viewed the region. Obviously, it's not to scale, but I think one of the most fascinating things is that it is oriented with east at the north. That is, you can see the Dead Sea is right in the middle of that region there. It's got some boats, massive boats by scale, floating on the Dead Sea, and there's a river, the Jordan River, that's at the left that would connect up to the missing Sea of Galilee, or Yam Kinneret. And so this is how pilgrims would have seen the land. They would have seen it with Jerusalem really at its center. Here is a close-up detail of Jerusalem, and comparisons with archaeological data indicate there's a lot of features here that indicate that the mosaic artists actually did have close experience with the land of Israel itself and the city of Jerusalem, with the Cardo Roman road running through the center of it. And there's all kinds of fascinating features in the map, such as, for example, if we zoom in on the boat in the Dead Sea, there are a couple of fishermen there, but they look sort of like potatoes, because what you can see, the figure on the right has a hand extending from it. The reason for this is because Muslim iconoclasts approached this map and wanted to wipe out any kind of reference to human beings, so they disfigured specifically the recognizably human faces on these forms, so we still have some sense of what they look like, and they replaced them obviously with other mosaic tiles. A fascinating kind of look at the land of Israel, but as I said, very confusing, obviously deeply affected by political and religious concerns. Here's a more conventional look at the land of Israel, with north at the top, as is the custom in Western cartography. And I think the most important thing that I can point out here is just how small the land of Israel is. I mean, check it out. If you go from the southernmost tip of the land of Israel in Eilat, at the Gulf of Aqaba, and you go all the way to the north, roughly equivalent with Mount Hermon in the Golan Heights, and you see that basically it's only 420 kilometers or 262 miles. If you could drive that in a straight road, it's basically 4 hours driving from one end of the country to the other. And the widest waste of the land is only 115 kilometers or 71 miles. You can easily drive across that in about an hour. I mean, this is essentially what people commute to work, crossing the entire country of Israel. When the lightly shaded areas, with Shechem or Nablus in the top and Hebron in the south, that refers to the West Bank, which we'll talk about much further on in this course. This is the region, of course, which is not annexed to Israel itself as the Palestinian Authority. And of course, you see the Gaza Strip there, which is sort of hatched, that is on the lower left side. Also, really a very small strip of land that looms large in the public imagination. If you were to take the amount of real estate that the state of Israel takes up in today's newspapers, for example, and you were to make that geographically to scale, I mean, it would be the size of, I don't know, Africa or something like that. But it is really a tiny little territory. Looking at it geographically, I think this map is especially helpful. This, of course, turns it on its side, facing to the east, somewhat like the Madaba map we saw earlier. And the most prominent feature, of course, is the Judean mountain range. They're not really mountains by, like, Rockies standards or the Alps. They're really more like dry, desiccated hills. And once again, this map, which is in Hebrew, shows that it's 53 kilometers from the Jordan River over the Judean mountains, and then an additional 16 kilometers to the sea, the Mediterranean itself. And it gives you some sense of the vertical topography and the climactic effect of those fairly low mountains. Here's one more view of the same idea. This is once again oriented north-south. You have the coastal plain, which is quite dense and gets a lot more rainfall. Then you have the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea, which are much lower. In fact, the Dead Sea is the lowest point on the surface of the earth. Now, let's look at the land of Israel in its regional context, because this is where it gets really important. How does this tiny little country subsume so much history and so much politics in contemporary time? If you look at this satellite view, you can see that Israel is very centrally located between the three continents of Africa, Europe, and Asia. And if you remove air travel, which of course was impossible in the ancient world, and if you consider the limitations of water travel, of sea travel because of land barriers, you can see that Israel is the main thoroughfare between those three continents. Any kind of trade typically has to go through Israel, unless you're talking about Europe to Asia directly or vice versa. Really, Africa, Asia, Europe are all connected to Israel over land route. If we look in a little closer, you see that one of the most important aspects of those connections is the Fertile Crescent. And it is so called because there's kind of like a C shape, or more precisely, kind of like an upside down flattened U shape of arable land that extends from the Nile Delta, which is in the lower left of this map. You can see it says in Hebrew Mitzrayim, or Egypt, and the hatched area represents the greater arability that is the product of the Nile River that flows from the bottom of this map into the Mediterranean Sea. And then there's a little bit of a dead spot to the right of the Nile Delta, where you have the Sinai Peninsula, but then the land of Israel itself becomes fertile again. It goes up north through Lebanon and Syria, and then it curves over and follows the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers down into the Persian Gulf, which would be today's Iraq and Kuwait. The two rivers that flow from the northwest and down into the southeast are the Mesopotamian region. The word Mesopotamia is from a Greek word meaning between the rivers, Mesopotamos. And so that's the Tigris and Euphrates represent another great fertile area. Now, these two regions on the extreme west, Egypt, and on the extreme east, Mesopotamia, are really the superpowers of the world, but any kind of land or commerce communication between them has to go through Israel. And note that it is not very practical to try and go straight, like let's say following the latitude from Egypt straight over to the Mesopotamian region, because that's essentially crossing a lot of desert, which is basically impassable and not practical except through camel caravans. It's much easier to follow the fertile settled regions and actually make travel from the southeast all the way up over the top and then down into Israel. This is in fact the route that the patriarch Abraham followed from ancient Sumer, the city of Ur, and then made his way up over the north through Syria and down into Israel. But we'll talk about that in a later lecture. Here is a roadmap of the ancient world where you get to see the actual routes that they would take. First of all, there was the so-called Via Maris, or in Hebrew, Derech Hayam, the way of the sea. I like to think of this as the scenic route, where you would go from the left, from the Nile Delta, and you would basically follow the coastline. And it's a little rough as you're going along the top of the Sinai Peninsula, because that's quite dry. But then once you hit the region of Gaza and move up north, then you've got quite a bit of settled territory and a lot of arable land, and you can follow the road all the way up and then down over to the right into Mesopotamia. The other route, which was also quite widely traveled, is the so-called King's Highway. There's actually a street like that in Brooklyn, of course, maybe named after this, I don't know, sometimes called the Royal Road, or in Hebrew, the Derech HaMelech. And this was a little bit shorter in the sense that you crossed the relatively small Sinai Peninsula compared to the great Arabian Desert. It's much more passable. And then you make a straight shot north up to Damascus. So it's not nearly as beautiful because you don't have the Mediterranean Sea to your left. At best, you have to travel through the very hot zone of the Dead Sea. But after that initial burst through the Sinai, then you've got fairly clear rest stops along the way, lots of gas stations as you make your way to Mesopotamia. And so Israel was extremely important as these commercial ventures expanded, and of course that becomes a political question as well. Perhaps what makes Israel so important to the rest of the world is the religious context that we're going to be exploring in a lot of lectures as we go on. It is the center really of three major world faiths, Judaism first, and then Christianity, and then Islam to a slightly lesser extent. And it's regarded as the navel of the world. In fact, that's a Hebrew term used in rabbinic literature for Israel and for Jerusalem specifically. This is a sentiment that is echoed by many other cultures. Have a look at this amazing 16th century map by Heinrich Bünting, which is meant to be kind of a thematic map. He published a lot of really beautiful maps that captured ideas in cartographic form, and you can see that he has indicated that Jerusalem specifically is at the center of European, Asian, and African history. Like a clover leaf. And if we zoom in here on Jerusalem, we get a beautiful sense of this very Christian sort of perspective of the region. You can see the three crosses there just outside the city. So that gives us a sense of the geographic features of the land of Israel, the political and economic features of the land in its regional context, and just a hint at what we're going to be discussing as we go further in this Jewish History Lab. Thank you very much for watching.